a powerful favorite, bound to the king by a relationship that sparked whispers and resentment across the court. Hugh Despenser's rise to power was swift, but it was his deep connection with Edward II that would ultimately seal his fate. Betrayed by those closest to him, Hugh faced a punishment so brutal, so symbolic, that it would echo through history. On November 24, 1326, the marketplace in Hereford, England, was packed with a mix of nobles, merchants, peasants, and clergy, all gathered for a spectacle of brutal justice. At the center, high above the crowd, a wooden platform stood, where a man was about to face a fate that would be etched in history. His name was Hugh Despenser, the Younger, once the most powerful man in England after the king himself, and today he would meet his end. Despenser, gaunt and pale from days of self-inflicted starvation, had once enjoyed a life of luxury. His fine clothes were now torn and filthy, a stark contrast to his former grandeur. What led this man, once the king's trusted favorite, to this gruesome fate? Hugh Despenser had accumulated tremendous power during the reign of King Edward II, and in doing so, made powerful enemies. His rise to power had been swift, due in part to his close relationship with Edward, and soon he was entangled in a web of political intrigue and betrayal. Hugh's story began in the late 13th century, born into privilege as the son of Hugh Despenser, the Elder, and Isabelle Beauchamp, daughter of the powerful Earl of Warwick. From an early age he was groomed for greatness, following in his father's footsteps of loyalty to the crown. When Edward II ascended to the throne in 1307, Hugh saw his chance to rise even higher, but his influence bred resentment, and the very people he trusted soon turned against him. Edward II, the new King of England, was already known for his preference for male favorites. His first intimate companion, Piers Gaveston, had caused a scandal at court, not just by monopolizing the king's affection, but by openly defying the traditional nobility. When Gaveston was violently murdered by rebellious barons in 1312, a power vacuum formed in the royal circle. Hugh Despenser, ever the opportunist, knew this was his moment. By 1316, Hugh had quickly cultivated a close bond with Edward, becoming his chamberlain. This position gave him unprecedented access to the king, allowing him to manipulate the monarch to his advantage. At the same time, Hugh solidified his power through a strategic marriage to Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece, which brought him control over the wealthy lordship of Glamorgan in Wales. As his relationship with Edward deepened, so did Hugh's thirst for more power and wealth. He became insatiable. Using his influence over the king, he twisted the law to seize lands from fellow nobles and vulnerable widows, even coercing his own sister-in-law to surrender valuable properties. When Hugh was exiled during a baronial rebellion in 1321, his ruthlessness reached new heights. He became a pirate, raiding English merchant ships with shocking audacity. But when Edward II regained control over the rebellious nobles, Hugh returned from exile more powerful than ever. Between 1322 and 1326, the Despensers, father and son, did not simply participate in government. They were the government. Hugh controlled access to the king, manipulated royal finances, and ruled over vast lands. As medieval historian Jean Froissart wrote, Hugh Despenser was king in everything but title. What made Hugh Despenser's power even more dangerous were the rumors swirling around his relationship with King Edward II. Though married with children, Hugh was widely suspected of being more than just a close advisor to the king. Whispers at court suggested that the two shared an intimate, even romantic, bond. Chroniclers from the time, using the term sodomite, hinted at a homosexual relationship between them, a sin not only condemned by the church, but one that also threatened the social and divine order of the time. Queen Isabella, Edward's wife and daughter of the King of France, grew increasingly hostile toward Hugh. The blatant favoritism Edward showed his companion humiliated Isabella, and she watched helplessly as her status, her resources, and even her access to her own children were diminished by Hugh's ever-growing influence. In 1324, Despenser pushed his control to new extremes by seizing the queen's lands and imprisoning members of her household. Even more scandalously, Hugh took custody of Isabella's children and placed them under the care of his own wife. This blatant power grab was the final straw for Isabella. In 1325, she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission to negotiate peace. There, she met Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who had escaped from the Tower of London after being imprisoned for opposing the Despensers. Mortimer, sharing Isabella's resentment, became both her lover and her ally in a dangerous conspiracy. Together, they plotted to overthrow Edward II and rid the kingdom of Hugh Despenser's ruthless influence. In September of 1326, Isabella and Roger Mortimer made a daring move, invading England with a small army of mercenaries. What shocked Edward II and the Despensers was how quickly the English nobility rallied to their cause. Years of oppression and humiliation had fueled a deep-seated hatred toward the king's favorites. As support for the king crumbled, Edward II and the Despensers fled westward, taking a large portion of the royal treasury with them. But their escape was futile. Hugh the Elder, captured in Bristol, met a horrific end. On October 27, 1326, he was hanged while still wearing his armor. His lifeless body was beheaded, quartered, and tossed to the dogs, a brutal punishment for a man who had once served the crown loyally. Meanwhile, Edward II and Hugh the Younger continued their flight through Wales, abandoned by nearly everyone. They were eventually captured near Neath. By mid-November, Edward was imprisoned and forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. But the worst was yet to come for Hugh Despenser. Knowing he had no hope of mercy, he attempted suicide through starvation, but his plan failed. On November 24th, he was dragged before a tribunal led by his bitter enemies, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and the Lancastrian barons, who had suffered greatly due to his greed. The trial, though a formality, was nothing more than a brutal spectacle. Hugh was accused of treason, corruption, theft, and manipulation of the king. The tribunal made sure the process appeared lawful, but the verdict was never in doubt. Hugh was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to one of the most gruesome executions in English history. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. On the morning of November 24th, 1326, Hugh Despenser was led to the marketplace in Hereford. The square was packed with an eager crowd, including Queen Isabella, Roger Mortimer, and the victorious barons. What followed was not just an execution, but a carefully staged public spectacle designed to destroy the man who had once held so much power. Tied to a tall ladder, Hugh was exposed for all to see. A crown made of nettles, a twisted mockery of the royal crown he had once shared with King Edward II, was placed on his head. His skin was scrawled with biblical verses condemning arrogance and evil. Then the real horrors began. Chronicler Jean Froissart described how the executioners severed Hugh's genitals, burning them before his eyes in a public display meant to punish him for his rumored sodomitical relationship with the king. Still alive, Hugh's abdomen was then slashed open, and his entrails slowly removed, burned in front of him. The sound of his agonizing cries echoed through the square, a grim satisfaction for the crowd. Only after this prolonged torture did Hugh meet his death. He was hanged, but even in death his humiliation was far from over. His body was beheaded and quartered, with parts of it sent to be displayed in different cities across the kingdom. His severed head was placed on a stake at the London Gate, serving as a brutal reminder of the fate awaiting those who dared abuse royal power. The execution of Hugh Despenser was not just a revenge for his cruelty and greed. It symbolized a cleansing of the kingdom, punishing the corruption he had brought through his influence over Edward II and his alleged sexual relationship with the king. The castration in particular was meant to highlight his perceived transgressions. Just 4 years after the brutal execution of Hugh Despenser, his widow, Eleanor de Clare, sought permission to retrieve his remains and lay them to rest on their family estate in Gloucestershire. However, the remains she recovered were pitifully few, only the head, a femur bone, and a handful of fragments. This meager collection of bones stood in stark contrast to the life he had once lived. Hugh, who had been second only to the king in power, now reduced to little more than relics scattered across the kingdom. It was a tragic end for a man who had once been the king's most trusted favorite. Edward II, too, met a grim fate, though his was more drawn out. Initially imprisoned, Edward was murdered in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. The most infamous account of his death though debated by some modern historians, is one that continues to haunt the historical imagination. The story claims that Edward was killed by a red-hot poker shoved into his rectum. This method, leaving no outward physical marks, was chosen deliberately to mirror the rumors surrounding his sexual life, rumors that had haunted his reign, painting him as a man consumed by his desires. The horrific symbolism of his death mirrored the kind of poetic justice inflicted upon Hugh Despenser. Both men, in their own ways, had been destroyed by the very accusations that once defined their relationships, accusations that intertwined their personal lives with their political undoing. The saga of Edward II's reign and the rise and fall of Hugh Despenser remains one of the most dramatic and turbulent periods in medieval English history. For centuries, these men were shaped in the public eye by homophobia and moral condemnation. Edward was cast as a weak king, ruled by his personal passions, while Hugh was painted as an unscrupulous manipulator who preyed on the king's vulnerabilities. Yet modern historians provide a more nuanced perspective. They acknowledge Hugh Despenser's undeniable greed and ruthlessness, qualities that alienated nearly all of the kingdom's nobility. However, they also suggest that many of the claims about his relationship with Edward II were politically motivated, fueled by sensationalism rather than fact. Accusations of sodomy, it turns out, were often wielded as weapons against political rivals, tools used to discredit and delegitimize powerful men like Hugh. In this light, the tales of his relationship with the king seem less like the truth and more like a smear campaign designed to destroy his reputation. Regardless of the true nature of their relationship, Hugh Despenser's fate is a chilling reminder of the deadly intersections of power, politics, and sexuality in medieval England. His execution wasn't just a legal matter, it was a calculated public spectacle, carefully crafted to communicate a message of moral and political justice. His body, mutilated and dismembered, became a symbol of the excesses of power and the price one pays for defying the established order. The public castration in particular was an act laced with meaning, representing sexual transgression, political corruption, and the need for a return to social harmony. It wasn't just about punishing one man for his actions. It was about sending a clear, unambiguous message to the kingdom about the consequences of overreaching ambition. Hugh Despenser's dramatic fall from grace is a story of political fortune turned on its head. In a matter of years, he had gone from a virtually unknown knight to the most powerful man in England, only to die a gruesome death, his body displayed across the kingdom. His story embodies the volatility of medieval power, the ruthless rise and catastrophic fall that was so often the fate of those who sought to accumulate too much influence. Yet, in a bitter twist of fate, the regime that replaced Edward II and the Despensers would not endure for long. Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, who had overseen Hugh's bloody execution, would themselves be overthrown just 4 years later when the young Edward III took the throne. Mortimer, once at the height of his power, would be hanged as a traitor, though spared the same torturous fate that Hugh had endured. The political wheel of medieval England had turned once again. Even now, nearly 7 centuries later, the story of Hugh Despenser continues to provoke fascination and horror. In a recent survey, he was named the greatest British villain of the 14th century, and even ranked among the worst Britons of all time. His life has been immortalized in plays, novels, and television shows, often portraying him as the archetypal corrupt courtier. Today, as we look back on his brutal execution, we shudder at the cruelty of the medieval justice system. But beyond the horror of his punishment, Hugh's story remains relevant. It offers a stark reminder of how power, greed, and exploitation continue to shape the world today. The image of the king's favorite, publicly humiliated, castrated, and hanged, serves as a chilling mirror to our modern world, where similar dynamics of power, manipulation, and justice still play out, sometimes with equally devastating consequences.